In this video, we're going to be learning about the key principles of Mendelian genetics, the branch of genetics that concerns itself with predicting whether an offspring organism will inherit the characteristics of its parents or not. Mendelian genetics is actually named after its founder, a Czech-German priest by the name of Gregor Mendel, who also happened to be an amateur botanist, meaning that he grew a lot of plants and became very proficient at observing key differences in the visible characteristics of those plants, specifically pea plants, and he used pea plants for two very specific reasons. Firstly, because they grow and reproduce very quickly, meaning that he didn't need to wait long to observe the differences or similarities in characteristics between offspring and parents, and secondly, most importantly, pea plants reproduce sexually, meaning that there is recombination of genetic information. Now, it's important to know that Mendel made all of these discoveries before anyone really knew what DNA was. In fact, Mendel and Charles Darwin came up with their findings almost within a decade of one another, and Charles Darwin actually wrote to inquire about Mendel's findings, but unfortunately the two could not speak the same language, and a lot of the findings of both respective scientists ended up solidifying the other's claims, and both of them were operating before the discovery of DNA as the hereditary molecule. Now, regardless of all of that background, Mendel's experiments with pea plants first started by looking at the difference in phenotype within the seeds, that being the actual peas within a pod of the pea plant. And Mendel would do experiments involving purebred strains, meaning that both parents that led to the offspring strain would have identical characteristics. And the two phenotypes that he observed, some strains would have smooth seeds that he designated with the short form uppercase S, while other strains would have wrinkled seeds, and he would designate this for simplicity with the short form little s. Now, what he would do is he would actually take purebred smooth strains and purebred wrinkled strains and have them reproduce with each other in order to create hybrid strains of pea plants, in that they contain both the DNA from the smooth-seeded pea plants and the DNA from the wrinkled seeded pea plants. And what Mendel observed is something rather interesting. He observed that even though the parent plants had completely different visible phenotypes, all offspring that were produced from these two pure plants actually had smooth seeds. Now, what this allowed Mendel to do is designate one of the two phenotypes as being dominant over the other, meaning that it was more likely that one characteristic would be inherited over the other. In other words, as long as the big S allele, the smooth allele, was present, the organism would have this smooth allele phenotype regardless of the DNA of the other parent. Now, in this particular pairing, what Mendel observed is that not a single offspring actually inherited the wrinkled characteristic. And so instead of being classified as dominant, the wrinkled characteristic or wrinkled phenotype was labeled as a recessive phenotype, meaning that it was essentially overwritten by the dominant allele. In other words, as long as one of the parents contributed DNA that produced smooth-shaped pea seeds, the dominant allele would override the other phenotype. So if this allele was paired with a dominant one, the organism will not have the recessive phenotype at all. And we can actually demonstrate this inheritance pattern using a tool that we call Punnett squares, and I can never remember whether Punnett has 2 N's or 2 T's, but I'm pretty sure it's actually 2 of both. Now, a Punnett square is a very simple tool that allows us to visualize probability, meaning we can actually visualize the chance of offspring organisms inheriting characteristics from one parent or from the other parent. In other words, they represent every possibility for heredity, meaning that they represent all possible genotypes that can be produced depending on what the parents are. So remember that both of these parents were purebred, meaning that the smooth-seeded plant from its mother and its father, or its maternal chromosome or paternal chromosome, both contain the dominant allele, uppercase S, whereas the wrinkled parent here would contain from both of its parents the recessive allele, little case s, and little case s. Now, we remember from how meiosis works that only 50% of DNA from the father organism and 50% of the DNA from the mother organism can be transferred because of independent assortment. And therefore, when the father P, if we assume the father is the dominant organism here, when it undergoes meiosis and produces sperm, the sperm will have uppercase S or uppercase S. It doesn't matter because both its maternal and paternal chromosome are the same allele. And likewise, this was the case for the maternal organism. And we can see that when this sperm and this egg come together, the offspring would have a dominant allele from the paternal organism and a recessive allele from the maternal organism. Then this possibility would be identical, receiving the dominant allele from the paternal organism and the recessive allele from the maternal organism. And we can see every one of the possibilities, no matter which gamete from the father organism and which gamete from the mother organism paired, every zygote that was created through every fertilization event would always have one dominant and one recessive allele. This shows us that all of the zygotes that are produced are indeed hybrid because they contain a mixture of dominant and recessive alleles, but it also explains why Mendel saw only smooth-seeded pea plants, because if we establish that smooth overrides the wrinkled phenotype and every one of these zygotes would inherit the dominant allele, this explains why Mendel only saw smooth-seeded pea plants. In the next video, what we're going to look at is what Mendel did following this in order to further reinforce that certain alleles are dominant while certain alleles are recessive. And what Mendel did, as we'll see in the next video, is taking the organisms that he produced during this first round of reproduction and what happened when they were made to reproduce.